I didn't know helping a janitor would make my boss laugh so hard, until the day that laugh cost him a $200 million deal. My name is Rachel Monroe, I'm 29 years old, and until 6 months ago, I worked as a senior marketing strategist at one of New York's most prestigious firms, Sterling and Company. A company built on luxury, polish, and profit. A company that measured your worth by how expensive your suit was, how powerful your handshake felt, and how well you could pretend to care. And my boss, Nathan Sterling, the CEO himself, was the king of that world, sharp, charming, and utterly ruthless. He was the kind of man who smiled like he owned the air you breathed. To him, every human interaction was a transaction. Even kindness had to be calculated. That's why the moment he saw me helping Luis, the janitor, pick up a stack of spilled cleaning supplies in the lobby, he didn't see decency. He saw weakness. It happened on a Thursday morning, one of those days where the office hummed with tension because a $200 million client deal was on the table. Everyone was dressed sharper, walking faster, pretending harder. Luis, a quiet man in his 50s who'd worked at the firm for over a decade, was restocking supplies when a cart wheel broke. Bottles scattered, a bucket rolled across the marble floor, and a few people actually stepped around him, as if helping him would stain their designer shoes. I didn't think twice. I bent down to help him gather everything up. He smiled at me, embarrassed, whispering, "Thank you, Miss Rachel." People usually just walk past. Before I could answer, Nathan's voice sliced through the air. "Well, isn't that sweet?" he said, standing by the elevator with his assistant, a smirk curling on his lips. "Our top strategist cleaning floors now? Should I start paying you hourly too?" The people nearby laughed, the kind of hollow, sycophantic laughter that always follows power. My cheeks burned, but I forced a polite smile. "Just lending a hand." Nathan chuckled. "Maybe focus on the pitch instead of charity work. Unless you plan on joining housekeeping." Then he walked off, still laughing. Luis tried to apologize to me, but I just shook my head. "Don't worry about it." But inside, something in me shifted. Nathan had always had a cruel sense of humor, but that day, it stung differently. Maybe because I'd admired him once. When I joined Sterling and Company 3 years ago, I saw him as a mentor, a visionary who'd built an empire from nothing. He'd taken me under his wing, praised my ideas, even called me his rising star. But as time went on, I noticed the cracks beneath his polished charm. The way he mocked the junior staff behind their backs. The way he took credit for others' ideas. The way he treated kindness like a flaw. Still, I told myself it was just corporate culture. Everyone had to play the game. Until that moment with Luis, when Nathan's laughter made me feel smaller than I'd ever felt in my career. And yet, somewhere beneath the humiliation, there was also something else. A quiet, simmering awareness that people like Nathan always underestimate others. Especially the ones who still believe in decency. That afternoon, the office was a storm of nerves and caffeine. The $200 million client, a European luxury conglomerate called Vandross Group, was scheduled for a final pitch. Months of research, design, and sleepless nights had gone into it. I'd been the one who developed the entire market entry strategy, but of course, Nathan would be the one presenting it. That was fine. That was normal. That was how the corporate world worked. But something strange happened before the meeting. Luis came to my desk quietly, holding a small, sealed envelope. "This fell near the conference room earlier," he said. "It had your name on it." I frowned. The envelope wasn't mine, but my name was on it, written in clean, bold letters. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper. No message. Just a photocopy of a document header, Vandross Group, confidential deal summary. I barely had time to process it before Nathan's assistant came rushing in. "Rachel, conference room. Now." "They're early." I slipped the paper into my folder and followed her, my mind spinning. Was it a mistake? A setup? Or something else entirely? As I walked into the glass-walled meeting room, Nathan was already there, all smiles and confidence. He winked at me like nothing had happened that morning. Like he hadn't turned a simple act of kindness into a public joke. But as the Vandross executives took their seats, I noticed something in their expressions, a flicker of discomfort, almost suspicion. Nathan didn't see it. He was too busy performing. And for the first time, as I watched him talk, something deep inside whispered, not loudly, but clearly enough to make my pulse quicken, something isn't right. I pushed the thought away. Maybe it was just nerves. Maybe it was nothing. But as it turned out, that quiet intuition was the first warning, the first sign that Nathan Sterling's empire was about to crumble. And that the very thing he mocked me for would be the reason he lost everything. The morning after the Vandross pitch, the office felt colder than usual. Not literally, the HVAC system was working fine, but the energy had shifted. There was a subtle tension in the air, the kind that prickles your skin before a storm. I sat at my desk, reviewing the final presentation slides one last time. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but my mind kept drifting back to Nathan. His laughter yesterday, the way he had mocked me in front of everyone. I tried to brush it off. It's just Nathan being Nathan, I told myself, but a gnawing unease lingered. Luis walked by, giving me a small, knowing nod. There was something about the way he glanced at me, like he had noticed things I hadn't. He held the elevator door open for me, and I felt a surge of gratitude, mixed with guilt. Why did I feel guilty for caring? Nathan arrived shortly after, walking through the office with his usual aura of charm. But today, his smile didn't reach his eyes. There was a coldness there, a calculated edge that made me pause. When he spotted me, he gave a brief nod, nothing more. Not the warm, rising star energy I'd been used to, not the mentoring tone. Just a nod, sharp and clipped. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe he was stressed about Vandross. Maybe he had a lot on his mind. Still, something about the way he avoided my gaze, the way he whispered instructions only to his closest lieutenants, set my instincts on high alert. By midday, I started noticing other things. Small, almost invisible cracks in Nathan's behavior. He called Sarah, a junior analyst, into his office and praised her idea for a client proposal loudly, enthusiastically, in front of everyone. Then, almost immediately, he dismissed another team member's suggestion, brushing it off with a curt, "Not the approach I'd take." The favoritism was blatant, yet subtle enough that people might not call it out. And when he spoke to me later, it was like speaking to a stranger. The warmth, the mentorship, the subtle encouragement I had counted on, all gone. His compliments were brief, almost mechanical, and his tone carried a sharp undertone I couldn't place. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was under pressure. Maybe he was just having a bad day. But my gut wouldn't let it go. It whispered that something was off. Later, during a team meeting, Nathan shared updates on the Vandross account. He highlighted the brilliant work of the senior team, except for me. Not a word about the weeks I'd spent creating the market strategy, not a single acknowledgement of my ideas. When I raised a point about the client's potential concerns, he interrupted. "Rachel, that's interesting. Let's focus on what the client actually wants, shall we?" His voice was polite on the surface, but the subtle dismissal stung. The words were meant to redirect, but to me, it felt like erasure. After the meeting, I sat at my desk, staring blankly at my laptop. Self-doubt crept in. Was I imagining things? Was I too sensitive? Had I misread his intentions all along? Over the next few days, the signs became harder to ignore. Emails I sent went unanswered. Ideas I presented in brainstorming sessions were credited to others. Luis seemed worried, often pausing mid-task to glance toward Nathan's office, as if he feared what might happen next. And Nathan, he smiled, yes, and he joked, and he praised others in front of me, but it always carried that same edge of coldness. There was a control in every gesture, a subtle manipulation that made me question my own judgment. One afternoon, I overheard him on a call with a client, speaking in a tone that was all charm, all business, but beneath it, I caught a hint of something I couldn't name: secrecy. Lies carefully wrapped in polite words. I didn't understand the details, but my instincts screamed that it was significant. That evening, I stayed late, going over the Vandross deal again. I tried to reassure myself, maybe Nathan's tough because he's under pressure. Maybe this is normal corporate politics. Maybe it has nothing to do with me. But every instinct in my body told me otherwise. Every time I thought of his laughter at Luis, every time I remembered the clipped nod that morning, every time I felt the subtle exclusion from credit and recognition, it all painted a picture I didn't want to see. I felt confused, hurt, and yes, a little betrayed. But betrayal was a word I couldn't yet claim. Too soon. Too uncertain. All I had was suspicion. A faint, uneasy whisper in the back of my mind that kept asking, who is Nathan Sterling really? And more importantly, what is he capable of when he thinks no one is watching? It was early Thursday morning when everything unraveled. I had arrived at the office earlier than usual, hoping to review the Vandross deal one last time before Nathan's big presentation. The elevator ride felt longer than usual, my fingers tapping nervously against my laptop bag. Something about the office that day felt wrong. The usual buzz of keyboards and murmured conversations seemed muted, almost tense. When I reached my desk, an email notification caught my eye. The subject line was simple, confidential, Vandross contract details. I didn't recognize the sender. Curiosity overrode caution. I clicked and froze. The attachment was a fully detailed, unredacted copy of the Vandross deal, the same strategy one had spent weeks crafting. But what shocked me wasn't that it existed, it was who it had been sent to. Nathan. Nathan Sterling had forwarded our firm's entire $200 million proposal to a competitor. Not accidentally. Not out of ignorance. Deliberately. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I read the email over and over, each word driving a knife through my chest. The subject line of his reply read, "For your eyes only, here's the Vandross strategy. Let's see if you can beat us." My stomach churned. My hand shook. I felt dizzy. I had known something was off, the coldness, the favoritism, the subtle manipulation, but I never imagined this. I had trusted him. I had believed in him. I had thought our professional loyalty meant something. And he had used it against us. I sank into my chair, staring at the screen as tears blurred my vision. Part of me wanted to scream, to run to Nathan and demand an explanation. But another part, the part that had quietly suspected this, that had felt the unease building over weeks, whispered, he knew. He always knew. And he planned this. The betrayal wasn't just corporate sabotage. It was personal. It was a calculated, deliberate act designed to humiliate me and ruin the people who had trusted him. I thought about the janitor, Luis, the way Nathan had mocked me for helping him. At the time, I had laughed it off, hiding the sting under a professional smile. But now it seemed prophetic. He had ridiculed kindness, and in doing so, he revealed the kind of man he really was, someone who would mock decency and exploit loyalty to get ahead. I pressed my temples, feeling a migraine building. Self-doubt crept in like a shadow. How did I not see it sooner? How could I have been so blind? Was I naive? Did I enable this by trusting him too much? Guilt gnawed at me. I had spent months under his mentorship, taking his praise as validation, believing in his charm and vision. And now, that very trust had been weaponized. For a few minutes, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of the shock. Betrayal. Disbelief. Pain. My body ached as if I had been punched. And yet, somewhere under that pain, a small ember began to glow, quiet, steady, and cold. I wiped my tears and leaned back, breathing slowly. Anger wasn't screaming yet, it hadn't erupted. But it was there, lurking in the back of my mind, a coiled presence. A thought repeated itself over and over. He underestimated me. He underestimated everyone. And that mistake will be his downfall. The office around me continued in its normal rhythm, phones ringing, keyboards clacking, coffee machines steaming, oblivious to the storm that had just broken inside me. I realized something else. Nathan had made a crucial mistake. He had underestimated not only decency, but also observation, patience, and quiet intelligence. He assumed that mocking a simple act of kindness meant he was untouchable. He assumed loyalty was weakness. And he had never considered that someone like me, someone who notices the little things, who senses shifts in behavior, who quietly strategizes, might be watching. I stared at the screen one last time, memorizing every word of his deceit. The shock began to harden into a simmering calm. The pain gave way to focus. The disbelief morphed into clarity. I wasn't going to cry anymore. I wasn't going to panic. I wasn't going to let him see that he had broken me. Not yet. Because now I had something he didn't. Awareness. And awareness, I realized, was far more dangerous than ignorance. I closed the laptop softly, the click echoing in the quiet office like the opening note of a symphony. A storm was coming. But for now, the world would see only calm. And that calm, that quiet, simmering anger, would be the beginning of my revenge. I sat alone in my apartment that evening, the city lights casting long shadows across the walls. The glow of my laptop screen still haunted me, a reminder of Nathan's betrayal. I replayed the email over and over in my mind, trying to digest the enormity of it. A $200 million deal sabotaged. My trust weaponized. Weeks of late nights and strategy sessions rendered meaningless because one man decided loyalty was expendable. I felt exhausted, shattered, and hollow. But amid the pain, something else stirred, a faint, stubborn pulse of defiance. For hours, I stared at the ceiling, letting myself grieve. I allowed the tears to fall freely, unashamed of the anger, the disbelief, the humiliation. Each emotion felt raw, almost suffocating, but necessary. It was like shaking off a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for months, the weight of expectation, of reliance, of blind trust. And then it hit me. No one is coming to save me. Not Nathan. He was the architect of my current misery. Not my colleagues. Most were either too afraid to notice or too busy looking out for themselves. Not anyone outside these walls. If I wanted justice, if I wanted to reclaim what was mine, my work, my dignity, my career, I had to do it myself. The thought hit me like a jolt. My pulse quickened, not with fear, but with clarity. For too long, I had let people define my worth, Nathan, the office hierarchy, even my own self-doubt. I had measured myself by the validation of others, and now I saw how fragile that reliance had been. Pain was unavoidable. Betrayal too. But strength was mine to claim. I opened my laptop and began to type, not emails to Nathan, not frantic messages to colleagues, but a list. A list of everything I knew, every observation, every piece of evidence, every document that proved how he had manipulated the Vandross deal. Names, dates, emails, strategy notes, Luis's testimony, security camera timings, the patterns of favoritism and manipulation. It was methodical. It was cold. It was quiet. And it was mine. As I compiled the information, I began to feel something shift inside me. The despair that had weighed me down all week started to lift. My fingers flew across the keyboard with a purpose I hadn't felt in months. Each piece of evidence I organized wasn't just a step toward exposing Nathan, it was a reclaiming of my own agency. I realized that anger, when harnessed properly, could be constructive. It could fuel strategy, sharpen focus, and turn betrayal into power. I didn't need to scream or lash out. I didn't need immediate vindication. I just needed patience, precision, and persistence. Luis had been right to trust me in small ways. Nathan had mocked my kindness, but that same empathy had kept me alert, aware, and capable of understanding people, and that awareness would become my greatest weapon. I paused for a moment and thought about how Nathan had underestimated me, as he underestimated everyone who dared show decency. The laughter, the sneer, the condescending comments, all of it now seemed laughable in hindsight. He had assumed control meant dominance, that fear meant loyalty. He had forgotten one crucial truth: intelligence, observation, and patience are quieter, slower forces, but far more devastating. I leaned back in my chair, letting the adrenaline settle into a steady rhythm. My chest still burned with the sting of betrayal, but now it carried the weight of clarity, not confusion. I was no longer a victim of circumstance. I was a strategist, a planner, and someone who could turn disadvantage into opportunity. I would expose him. I would protect what I had built. And I would win. That night, I made another realization. This wasn't just about the Vandross deal. It was about every time someone tried to belittle me, every time loyalty was exploited, every time my kindness was mocked. Nathan's betrayal had been personal, yes, but it had also been universal. It symbolized a culture I refused to accept. Pain could break a person. Betrayal could destroy trust. But I could transform that pain into purpose. I could channel my anger into strategy, my disappointment into action, my grief into empowerment. I closed my laptop gently, the silence of the apartment suddenly comforting. Tomorrow, I would step into the office with a new mindset. Tomorrow, I would begin the slow, deliberate process of reclaiming my power. I would be quiet, patient, and precise. I would watch. I would plan. I would wait for the moment when the storm I was building would hit. And when it did, Nathan Sterling would see, too late, that mocking kindness and underestimating intelligence was a mistake he would pay for. For the first time in days, I slept that night not with fear, but with purpose. I learned quickly that revenge for something this cleanly cruel couldn't be loud or messy. It had to be surgical, patient, precise, and boring enough that nobody would notice the blade being sharpened. I slept in measured bursts, drank bitter coffee, and mapped out every avenue Nathan had used to betray us. Every arrogance he displayed was now a vulnerability I could exploit. First, evidence. Not the kind of vague suspicion that gets shrugged off in HR meetings, but the kind that leaves no room for excuses: email headers, IP logs, access timestamps, security footage, and witnesses who remembered the right days. I opened the email from that morning dozens of times, studied the routing information, and noted the forwarding chain. Nathan had been sloppy in his confidence. He'd used his personal account for a portion of the correspondence and forwarded files from an unsecured device during a private meeting. Confidence leaves fingerprints. I started where no one would look, the edges. Luis, who had surprised me with that envelope in part 1, became my first ally. At first I'd hesitated. He was a janitor, a quiet man whose life wasn't the kind to be pulled into office wars. But Luis knew patterns. He worked late, he emptied bins, he sat in the lobby while deals were presented, and he saw faces come and go. He'd noticed Nathan's assistant sneaking into the conference room the night before the Vandross meeting. He'd clocked unusual deliveries. He'd seen a forgotten USB drive in the trash one evening, half swallowed by coffee grounds. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked once, brow furrowed, when I showed him a redacted copy of the email. His hands were steady. He had a quiet dignity that made me trust him more than 1,000 polished resumes. "We don't have a choice," I said. "But you help me, and I'll make sure no one hurts you for it." He agreed, not because he wanted glory, but because he wanted fairness. He started quietly logging oddities for me, which doors were propped open after hours, when the security guards' rounds shifted, and when Nathan stayed in the office later than usual. He took notes that looked like grocery lists, but were actually timestamps and tiny clues. Next, tech. I needed access to the digital skeleton of the firm's communications without setting off alarms. Going to IT felt risky, anyone could flag that, but there was one person who owed me a favor from a campaign I'd saved last year, Amina, an analyst in compliance who I'd pulled into a last-minute client review and who'd later credited me for the save. She was meticulous, good-humored, and quietly resentful of Nathan's favoritism. I slid her a coffee and a short, honest explanation about the email. She didn't ask for proof. She asked, "What do you want me to look for?" And that was all I needed. Amina pulled metadata like a master. She traced the forwarded message to a time window when the office cameras had shown Nathan leaving the conference area for a private phone call. She found an IP address that corresponded not to a company server but to a personal hotspot in the executive suite. She exported logs in formats that HR couldn't easily dismiss, PDFs with headers, timecodes, and verifiable hashes. She whispered, "He left fingerprints." He used his assistant's login for a loop. I felt my chest unclench a fraction. With Luis and Amina quietly compiling a dossier, I started assembling emotional traction. People respond to narratives, not raw data. I needed a story that would make the data matter, a sequence of small, human moments that would make anyone reading the cold logs feel the betrayal. That's where Sarah came in. Sarah was the junior analyst Nathan had publicly praised. He'd shoved her into the spotlight, given her a smile, and handed off the facade of mentorship. She liked Nathan. She wanted to be liked by Nathan. But she also answered to logic and proof, and when I took her aside, I didn't beg, I showed. I showed her the timeline of meetings, the copies of her own slide decks that had been altered, the moments when her ideas were applauded publicly and quietly annotated with Nathan's initials later. I let her see how small acts of theft accumulated into the big betrayal. She didn't join me out of malice. She joined because she saw the pattern. Once she was with us, the small leaks started to matter. She mentioned, offhandedly, that a Vandross executive had privately complained about receiving unsolicited competitor questions right after Nathan's meeting. That single sentence opened another door. We began setting traps that looked like accidents. I purposefully left a printout of a less sensitive slide on my desk with a visible, redacted footer, a slide that suggested we were nervous about leaks. Intentionally, we made it look like I'd recorded my own paranoia. Nathan's arrogance guaranteed his next move. He continued to belittle my quiet presence in meetings, even going so far as to ask a visiting partner if Rachel was still doing the housekeeping. He believed me broken. He believed his jokes had cut me down. He believed no one was watching. But that belief made him reckless. He kept forwarding things, kept using the assistant's login, kept brazenly stepping into gray areas. Each time, we noted it. Each time, Amina recorded. Each time, Luis confirmed the physical movement. Each time, Sarah corroborated the social fallout. I created backup copies and sent anonymous, tightly worded summaries of inconsistencies to a couple of sympathetic senior staff outside Nathan's inner circle, people whose ethics were more important than their careers. I didn't accuse, I seeded doubt. Every move was deliberate and emotionally charged. I didn't want him exposed in a single, cathartic roar. I wanted his world to crumble slowly, internally, until his allies had to choose loyalty to a man who gambled with the firm's integrity, or loyalty to a firm they actually believed in. On a Wednesday evening, I sat at my desk and placed a final, quiet piece into motion. I scheduled a confidential meeting with Vandross's liaison, not to accuse, but to ask one simple question I already knew the answer to. Had they received any unsolicited proposals from Nathan's circle within the past week? If they said yes, we would have the smoking gun. If they said no, the dossier we'd built would still stand. As I hit send on the meeting request, I glanced up. Nathan passed by my desk with that same smug smile, unaware. He looked at me, nodded with that practiced dismissiveness, and walked on, certain of his invincibility. He still thought I was broken. He still thought he had won. He had no idea we were just getting started. The morning the trap closed felt like the calm before a storm, but I was no longer nervous. I was precise. The sky outside the glass tower had that washed, winter light that makes everything look sharper, more honest. I walked into the Vandross liaison's temporary office with a slim folder, hands steady, heels clicking like a metronome. No theatrics. No begging. Just facts arranged like surgical instruments. The liaison, Mr. Monroe, greeted me with polite surprise. He'd agreed to the meeting because my email had been measured, professional, asking only for clarity. He didn't expect an ambush. That's the advantage of patience. People lower their guard when you're quiet. I opened the folder and laid out the first piece, a printout of the forwarded email with full headers, timestamps, and an IP trace that led straight to an executive hotspot registered to Nathan's suite. I watched his face change, subtly at first, then unavoidably. I didn't speak. I let the paper do the talking. "Is this the Vandross strategy?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said. "It was intended for your team. It was not intended for Nathan Sterling's competitors." He swallowed. "We did receive an unsolicited contact from a competitor after that presentation." His voice was flat. "But why bring this to me? We already declined any further talks. Because they used our strategy to pitch you, and the evidence points back to Sterling and company," I replied. "You deserve to know who's playing with your trust." I watched as the last of Mr. Monroe's professional armor cracked. He made a call then and there, a short, sharp conversation. Within an hour, Vandross confirmed, yes, they had an unsolicited approach, and no, they would not move forward while there was doubt about confidentiality. That was step one. Step two required a different stage. The boardroom at Sterling and Company is a theater, long table, walnut veneer, portraits of past CEOs staring down like silent jurors. I had booked a formal review under the guise of clarifying deal protocols. The board convened, Nathan swaggering in first as if he were about to receive praise. He was still smug, certain that whatever murmur had started would be smothered by his charm. Instead, I walked in with the dossier we'd built, Amina's metadata exports, Sarah's corroborations, Luis's timestamps and witness notes, the camera footage showing Nathan alone with a USB during off hours, and the security logs proving he'd used an assistant's login to mask his activity. Each piece was labeled, clean, and impossible to dismiss as hearsay. Silence settled like dust. I began with the timeline calm, steady, narrated like a case presentation rather than a vendetta. I didn't shout. I didn't plead. I described dates, times, how the forwarded email matched Vandross's timeline, how the competitor's proposal mirrored our strategy almost verbatim, how Nathan's pattern of favoring certain faces aligned with the opportunities he created for himself. When I played the security footage, the room watched in mute horror. On screen, Nathan moved through the conference area with practiced ease, slipped a thumb drive into his pocket, paused to compose a message, then stepped into his private office where he used an unsecured device. Later footage, timestamped, showed the assistant logging on from a workstation that matched the metadata Amina had pulled. The little tells were there: the adjustment of a cuff, the nervous clearing of a throat, the small habitual laugh Nathan used to use to cloak guilt. His supporters shifted. Some glanced at one another. The partner who had once praised Nathan's vision looked away. The CFO's face, usually unreadable, tightened. Nathan's voice, which had always been silk, frayed as he tried to explain. He fumbled with excuses, a misdirected email, an open device. Someone else must have forwarded it, but each rebuttal collided with the evidence like a poor script against a jury of facts. Then came the quietest, sharpest cut. I asked the board to watch a clip, a recording of an offhand voicemail left by Nathan to a rival executive, a smug, casual exchange in which he joked, "Let them think they're clever. It'll be interesting to see if they can match the real strategy." It was recorded because Amina had cross-checked delivery times with security logs and found the voicemail on a related device. The room fell into a kind of stunned hush. Nathan's face drained as the laughter from his voice turned to an admission in the air. Vandross immediately put the relationship on hold and launched an independent audit. The board, faced with the incontrovertible evidence, moved faster than I'd dared hope. Within hours, Nathan was suspended pending investigation. News of the suspension, not the full details, but the implication leaked. The market reacted with a small, sharp ripple. Clients called. Partners asked questions. Nathan, whose empire had been built on cultivated bravado, now sat like a man waiting for a verdict. Through it all, I remained composed. I answered questions methodically, never gloating, never raising my voice. My fury was folded into my tone like steel under silk, strength with a smooth surface. Luis stood at the back and I caught his eye. He gave a minute nod, the kind that carries gratitude without spectacle. As the boardroom emptied, Nathan lingered. He stared at me with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and a dawning, slow panic. "You'll regret this," he said, voice low. "Perhaps," I replied, closing my folder. "But I'll sleep tonight knowing I did the right thing." He opened his mouth again, but the words fell into the empty room like thin paper. The board's decision hung heavier than either of our voices. Outside, rain began to streak the windows, blurring the city into watercolor. Nathan stood there, soaked in consequence. I walked past him with the quiet grace of someone who had taken back what was hers. You could feel the change in the air, not triumphant fireworks, but a clean, settling calm. Justice, I'd learned, didn't always shout. Sometimes it arrived like a steady tide that pulls the shore clean. And as I stepped out of the boardroom, the rain washing the tower's glass, I felt something I hadn't in weeks, peace-edged with the cool certainty that the world had shifted and that I had done what needed to be done. The office was quieter than usual the morning after the boardroom fallout. Nathan Sterling's absence was palpable, his tailored suits still hanging neatly in the coat closet, his polished shoes absent from the marble floors. Rumors of suspension and internal investigations swirled quietly, but I didn't need to chase them. The evidence had spoken louder than whispers ever could. I walked through the lobby with a calm step, past Luis cleaning without a word, and he gave me a small, respectful nod. I returned it with a smile, not out of obligation, but because in that simple gesture, I felt the world shift beneath my feet. It was a small victory, one that mattered infinitely more than any corporate accolade. The Vandross deal had been secured, yes, under stricter scrutiny, but more importantly, the culture at Sterling and Company had been shaken. Favoritism, deceit, and exploitation had been exposed, leaving the company scrambling to rebuild integrity. Nathan, the man who had mocked my kindness, who had weaponized loyalty for his amusement, had lost more than a deal. He had lost the illusion of control, and the people who once admired him now looked elsewhere for leadership. As I sat at my desk that morning, sipping a hot cup of coffee, I let myself reflect. Months of manipulation, betrayal, and humiliation had felt like a storm battering me from every side. But storms, I realized, don't just destroy, they reveal. They strip away pretense, expose weaknesses, and leave behind clarity. I had learned things about myself that I could never have discovered in calm waters. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in patient persistence. Trust is precious, yes, but discernment is equally vital. And self-worth. Self-worth is not defined by how loudly someone praises you or how cruelly they mock you. It is measured by how firmly you stand when the world underestimates you. Luis stopped by, leaning lightly on the doorway. "You okay?" he asked, a simple question loaded with unspoken acknowledgement. "I've never been better," I said, and meant it. There was a lightness in my chest, an almost dizzying relief. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't watching every shadow, analyzing every glance, or questioning my instincts. The danger had passed, but the lessons remained. I could carry them forward, stronger and wiser. I thought of Nathan, the arrogance that had blinded him, the cruelty that had fueled his overconfidence. I felt no joy in his fall, only a quiet satisfaction. Poetic justice had found him in the place he believed untouchable. He had mocked kindness, and in doing so, he had underestimated the quiet, deliberate power of integrity. And that is the real victory. The kind that doesn't scream for attention, doesn't demand acknowledgement, but transforms pain into purpose and betrayal into strength. As I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of the city sprawling beneath me, rain glinting on streets and rooftops, I realized something profound. People like Nathan thrive on doubt and fear. But when you refuse to let them define your narrative, when you reclaim your agency with clarity and patience, they crumble quietly while you rise unmistakably. I picked up my phone, typed a quick message to Amina, Sarah, and Luis, thanking them for their vigilance and courage. Teamwork had been my shield and my sword, and I wouldn't forget it. I leaned back in my chair, breathing slowly, savoring the stillness, when a thought struck me. Betrayal is like fire. It can burn everything in its path, or it can forge steel. I had chosen the latter. And for anyone watching this story unfold, here's what I want you to remember. Betrayal is not the end of your story. It is the opening chapter of a stronger, sharper version of yourself. Trust wisely. Stand firmly. Protect your worth. And when someone tries to diminish you, let your quiet strength speak louder than their arrogance ever could. Now I turn to you. Have you ever faced betrayal? Have you ever been underestimated, mocked, or exploited by someone you trusted? How did you respond? Share your story in the comments below. Let's turn pain into power together. And before you go, remember this. He laughed at my kindness, but it was that same kindness that built the foundation for his downfall. If you've ever been underestimated, undervalued, or betrayed, subscribe and follow this journey. Because strength isn't about revenge alone, it's about reclaiming your life, one quiet victory at a time.